At -96 degrees Fahrenheit, the forest had already decided Emily Carter would die, her boots dragging through knee-deep snow as the wind cut through her coat like knives, each breath thinner than the last until even the sound of her own voice disappeared into the storm and she realized no one would ever hear her scream again, her knees buckling, body folding into the white silence as if the earth itself was swallowing her whole, and that was when she saw it, two golden eyes burning. Through the blizzard, a wolf, still, watching, not charging, not circling, just waiting, close enough now that she could see its breath in the air, close enough that she shut her eyes expecting teeth, but none came, only warmth, impossible warmth, as the animal pressed against her frozen body, shielding her from the wind like something that should not exist, and when she opened her eyes again the wolf was tugging at her sleeve, pulling, urging, dragging her deeper into the forest, not out. Deeper, and every instinct told her this was wrong. This was death wearing mercy as a mask, but she followed anyway because stopping meant dying, and suddenly, light, flickering between the trees, hope, a cabin maybe, salvation, she stumbled toward it, but the ground cracked beneath her, ice splitting, snow collapsing into darkness, and in one violent motion the wolf slammed into her, throwing her clear as the earth gave way. Its body vanishing into the collapsing white below, a sharp cry. Swallowed by the storm, and Emily lay there shaking, alive, staring at the empty space where it had been, until she saw it, blood in the snow, a trail, leading forward, leading somewhere, and she realized the wolf hadn't brought her to safety, not yet. The forest doesn't kill you all at once, it lets you realize you were never meant to survive in the first place, the wind seemed to whisper as Emily Carter pushed one more step forward into the endless white, -96 degrees Fahrenheit pressing into her bones like a silent verdict already signed, her breath coming out in thin, fragile clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared, as if even the air refused to acknowledge her existence. And with every step her boots sank deeper into the snow, heavier, slower, until lifting her own legs felt like dragging someone else's body behind her, and somewhere in the distance the world had disappeared completely, no sky, no horizon, just a pale void swallowing everything, including sound, including hope, including the faint memory of warmth she could barely recall, and Emily tried to remember why she had kept moving. Tried to hold on to the idea that somewhere ahead there had to be something. Shelter, light, anything, but the thought slipped through her mind like ice water, leaving nothing behind but a growing silence, and then her foot caught on something unseen beneath the snow and she fell, not hard, not sudden, but slow, like gravity itself had grown tired, her body folding into the cold as she lay there staring upward into the blank sky that offered no answer, her fingers numb, her face stinging, her heartbeat slowing into something distant and unfamiliar, and for the first time. She didn't try to get up right away, because a quiet, dangerous thought had begun to settle in, that maybe this was where it ended, maybe this was where people simply stopped, where movement no longer mattered, where the cold finished what exhaustion had already started, and as her eyes drifted half-closed the world grew softer, quieter, almost peaceful in a way that didn't feel right, like slipping into something that asked nothing more of her. But then something changed, not a sound, not a shape, but a feeling, the unmistakable sense that she was no longer alone, and slowly, with what little strength she had left, Emily forced her eyes open again, and at first she saw nothing but the same endless white, the same empty silence, until it wasn't empty anymore, because there, just beyond the edge of visibility, something darker moved against the snow, something that did not belong to the stillness, and then it stopped, perfectly still, watching, and it took her a moment to understand what she was seeing, a shape forming out of the storm, lean, steady, patient, and then the eyes appeared, 2 points of quiet intensity cutting through the blizzard, fixed on her with a focus that felt almost deliberate, almost knowing, and her breath caught in her throat not from the cold this time but from recognition, because she knew exactly what it was, a wolf, close enough now that she could see the faint outline of its fur shifting with the wind, close enough that it could reach her in seconds if it chose to, and every instinct she had left told her the same thing, that this was how it ended, not with the cold, not with the silence, but with something that had been waiting long before she ever fell, something that had followed her long enough to know she wouldn't fight back, and yet the wolf did not move, it did not rush, it did not circle, it simply stood there, watching her as if measuring something unseen, and the seconds stretched longer than they should have, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for the moment to feel wrong, because predators do not hesitate, not like this, not when survival is simple. And Emily felt something shift deep inside her, not hope. Not yet, but confusion, a question forming where fear should have been, and as the wind howled around them and the cold pressed harder against her fading body, the wolf took a single step closer, and then stopped again, as if deciding something that had nothing to do with instinct, nothing to do with hunger, and everything to do with something she could not yet understand, and for reasons she could not explain. Emily did not close her eyes this time, because something about the way it looked at her made her wonder, if the forest had already chosen her death, why hadn't it happened yet? The wind did not slow, but something else did, because the wolf remained where it stood, unmoving, its eyes fixed on Emily as if the storm itself no longer mattered, and she realized with a slow, creeping awareness that if it had wanted to close the distance it already would have, which meant the silence between them was not hesitation but intention, and that thought unsettled her more than fear ever could, because fear was simple, fear had rules. But this did not, and her fingers twitched weakly against the snow as she tried to push herself up, her arms shaking under a weight that felt far greater than her own body, her muscles refusing to respond the way they once had, and for a moment she almost gave in again, almost let herself sink back into the cold where everything became easier, quieter, but then the wolf moved, not fast, not aggressive, just one deliberate step closer, its paws silent against the frozen ground, and she froze, breath caught somewhere between instinct and exhaustion, waiting for something that did not come, because instead of lunging or circling, the animal lowered its head slightly, as if observing her more carefully, and there was something in that movement that felt wrong in a way she could not explain, not threatening, not gentle, just aware, and Emily forced herself to breathe, slow and shallow, as the cold pressed harder into her chest, each inhale sharper than the last, and she realized she could not stay here, not like this, because whether the wolf chose to act or not, the cold would finish what it had started, and with everything she had left. She rolled onto her side and tried again to rise, her knees slipping, her boots sliding uselessly against the packed snow, until finally she managed to push herself upright, swaying, barely balanced, her vision narrowing at the edges as the world seemed to tilt around her, and when she looked up again the wolf had not retreated, it had moved closer still, close enough now that she could see the texture of its fur, the way the frost clung to it, the steady rhythm of its breathing, and for a brief, disorienting moment she felt something she should not have felt at all, not here, not now, but recognition, as if this creature belonged to the same silence that had nearly taken her, and yet stood apart from it, and then, without warning, the wolf turned, not away from her but slightly to the side, its body angling toward a direction she had not noticed before, and it paused, glancing back at her, not with urgency, not with force, but with something that felt almost like expectation. And Emily stared, her mind struggling to understand what she was seeing, because predators did not guide, they did not wait, they did not look back to see if you followed, and yet that was exactly what it was doing, standing there in the storm, looking at her as if the next moment depended on a choice she did not remember making, and the cold tightened around her again, sharper now, more insistent, and she knew she could not stand still much longer, because stillness here was the same as surrender, and yet moving toward the wolf felt just as uncertain, just as dangerous, and for a second she hesitated, caught between two endings she could not escape, until her body made the decision for her, one unsteady step forward, then another, her legs trembling as she moved in the direction the wolf had turned, and the moment she did, the animal began to walk, slow and steady, not looking back again, as if it already knew she would follow, and with every step she took the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees growing darker, the wind shifting in ways she could not predict, and a quiet thought settled into her mind, one that refused to leave, that she was no longer trying to find a way out. She was following something deeper into a place she did not understand, and she could not tell if that meant she had just chosen to live, or chosen a different kind of ending. The deeper they moved, the more the world began to feel unreal, as if the forest was no longer a place but a presence watching every step Emily took, the snow beneath her boots no longer soft but uneven, unpredictable, hiding shapes and dips that threatened to pull her down again, and each time she stumbled the cold rushed in faster, sharper, reminding her how little strength she had left, and still the wolf continued ahead of her, never rushing, never slowing, its pace steady in a way that made it seem untouched by the same freezing air that was draining her life with every passing second, and Emily tried to focus on its movement, on the rhythm of its steps, because looking anywhere else made the world spin, made the silence feel heavier, and there was something about following that rhythm that kept her from collapsing again, as if the act of watching it gave her just enough reason to take another step, and another, until time itself began to blur, minutes or hours. She could not tell, the forest repeating itself in endless white and shadow, and then suddenly the wolf stopped, so abruptly that Emily nearly walked into it, her breath catching as she forced herself to stay upright, her vision flickering at the edges, and for a moment nothing happened, no sound, no movement, just the wind pressing against them both, until the wolf lifted its head slightly, its ears turning toward something she could not hear, and a quiet tension settled into the space between them, something subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had shifted, and Emily felt it too, not as a sound but as a pressure, a change in the way the cold moved around her. An instinct told her something ahead was wrong, something she could not see yet, and before she could even form the thought fully, the wolf moved again, but not forward this time, instead circling slightly, positioning itself between her and whatever lay ahead. Its body angled protectively without hesitation, and that was the moment everything changed, because this was no longer uncertainty, no longer curiosity. This was a choice, clear and deliberate, and Emily felt it deep in her chest, a realization she could not ignore, that the animal was not just leading her somewhere, it was keeping her from something else, and her heart began to pound faster despite the cold, a fragile surge of awareness cutting through the numbness as she glanced past the wolf into the distance, trying to see what it had sensed, and at first there was nothing, only the same pale emptiness stretching endlessly forward, but then she noticed it, a faint shift in the snow, a subtle movement where the surface seemed too smooth, too quiet, and something about it made her stomach tighten, because it did not look like solid ground, it looked like something waiting to give way, a hidden break beneath the surface, and she took a small step back without thinking, her body reacting before her mind could fully understand. And the wolf did not move, it remained exactly where it was, blocking her path, as if confirming what she had just realized, and for a long second neither of them moved, the wind howling louder now as if trying to erase the moment, to push them forward into the unseen danger, but they did not go, and slowly, carefully, the wolf shifted again, stepping to the side and beginning a new path, one that curved away from the hidden threat and deeper into the trees, and Emily hesitated, her breath unsteady, because now the choice was clearer than ever, follow the wolf into the unknown or risk the path ahead that might not hold her weight at all, and the fear returned, stronger this time, not just of the cold, not just of the forest, but of the truth she was beginning to understand, that the only thing keeping her alive right now was the very creature she had been taught to fear, and that thought should have been impossible, should have pushed her away, should have made her turn back, but instead it did something else entirely, it made her take another step forward, following the wolf once more, even as a quiet question echoed in her mind, one that refused to leave. If it could sense danger she could not see, what else did it know that she did not? The path the wolf chose did not feel safer, it felt quieter, and that was somehow more unsettling, because the wind that had been clawing at Emily's body began to fade as the trees thickened around them, their dark trunks rising like silent walls that blocked the storm just enough to change its voice into something lower, more distant, and for a moment she almost believed this was relief, almost believed that the worst was behind her. But something inside her resisted that thought, because nothing about this place felt like safety, it felt like a pause, like the forest was holding its breath, and the wolf continued forward without hesitation, weaving between the trees with a certainty that made her feel even more out of place, her own steps uneven, unsteady, each movement costing more than the last as the cold tightened its grip around her chest, making every breath feel thinner, weaker, and she realized she could not feel her fingers anymore, not even when she tried to move them. And that realization should have frightened her, should have pushed her into panic, but instead it brought a strange calm, the kind that comes when the body begins to let go, and she hated that feeling, because it made stopping seem easier than continuing, and yet she kept moving, because the wolf kept moving, and somewhere along the way following it had become the only thing she trusted more than her own instincts, and then it happened again, the wolf slowing, not stopping this time but shifting its pace just enough for her to catch up, and for the first time she found herself close enough to reach it, close enough to see the small details she had missed before, the faint frost clinging to its fur, the steady rise and fall of its breathing, the way it occasionally glanced to the side as if listening to something beyond her awareness, and she realized with a quiet shock that it was adjusting for her, not leaving her behind, not forcing her to keep up, but matching her, guiding her, and that thought settled into her mind with a weight she could not ignore, because predators do not guide, they do not adjust, they do not consider weakness as something to protect, and yet that was exactly what was happening, and she did not understand why. And the question grew louder with every step, until it became impossible to ignore. Why her? Why now? Why this? And the forest offered no answer, only more silence, more shadow, more endless white stretching between the trees, and then the ground beneath her foot shifted again, but this time it did not give way, it dipped, uneven. A subtle drop that threw her balance just enough to send her forward, her body tilting, her strength failing to catch her in time, and for a brief second she knew she was going down, knew she would not get back up again, but before she could hit the snow something solid pressed against her side, steady, firm, holding her upright just long enough for her to regain her balance, and when she looked down she realized it was the wolf, its body braced against her, supporting her weight without hesitation, and the moment stretched longer than it should have, long enough for her to feel the warmth of its fur through the cold, long enough for her to understand what had just happened, and slowly she stepped back, her breath unsteady, her mind struggling to process something that did not belong in any version of reality she understood, because this was not instinct, this was not accident, this was something else entirely, something deliberate, something chosen, and the wolf pulled away just as quietly as it had stepped in, continuing forward as if nothing had happened, as if this was simply part of whatever path it had already decided on, and Emily stood there for a second longer than she should have, staring at the place where it had been, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a reason that fit into the world she knew, but nothing did, and that was when the realization finally settled in, not sudden, not overwhelming, but slow and undeniable, that whatever this creature was doing, it was not random, it was not temporary, it was not a moment that would pass, it was something deeper, something that had already begun long before she noticed it. And as the wind shifted again and the cold pressed harder into her fading strength, she understood one thing with absolute clarity, that if she stopped now she would not survive, and if she kept going she would have to trust something she did not understand, and for a second she wondered which choice was more dangerous, until the wolf stopped once more ahead of her, turning just enough for its eyes to meet hers again, and this time the look felt different, not distant, not observing, but waiting, as if the next step was not just hers to take, but hers to choose. Emily did not remember deciding to trust the wolf, but she remembered the moment she realized she already had, because when it stopped and looked back at her, something inside her no longer resisted, no longer questioned, it simply followed, and that was more frightening than anything else, because trust should have taken time, it should have needed proof, and yet here, in the middle of a frozen world that had stripped everything else away, it had formed in silence, without permission, without reason, and as she took another step toward it, she felt the last fragments of her old instincts fall behind her like something she no longer carried, and the wolf turned again, continuing forward into a narrower stretch of forest where the trees grew closer together, their branches heavy with snow that dimmed what little light remained, and the air here felt different, thicker, almost still, and for the first time since she had fallen, Emily noticed something else beneath the cold, a faint shift in temperature, not warmth exactly, but less deadly, just enough to be felt if she paid attention, and she did, because now every small change mattered, every detail was a possibility, and she focused on the way the wolf moved, not just forward but with purpose, weaving between certain trees, avoiding others, choosing a path that did not look random, and she began to realize that this was not wandering, this was navigation, and that realization brought with it a fragile thread of hope that she had not allowed herself to feel until now. But hope in a place like this was dangerous, because it made you believe in things you could not see yet, and as if answering that thought, the forest shifted again, opening slightly ahead of them into a small clearing where the snow lay smoother, untouched by wind, and the wolf slowed as it entered, its movements more cautious now, more deliberate, and Emily followed, her steps weaker but driven by something stronger than fear, and as she crossed into the clearing she felt it more clearly, the change in the air, subtle but real, and then she saw it, not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, like something revealing itself only when she was close enough to understand, a dark shape half buried beneath snow and shadow, low to the ground, almost invisible from a distance, and for a second her mind could not place it, could not recognize what she was looking at, until the shape resolved into something familiar, something human, a structure, small, worn, barely standing, but there, real, and her breath caught, not from the cold this time but from the sudden surge of disbelief, because this should not have been here, not in a place like this, not hidden so completely that she would have walked past it without ever knowing, and she took a step forward, then another, her body trembling not just from exhaustion but from something dangerously close to relief, and the wolf stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching her, not entering with her, and that detail did not go unnoticed, because it felt intentional, like a boundary it had chosen not to cross, and Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting between the structure and the animal, unsure of what this meant, unsure if this was the end of whatever path they had been on or just another step she did not yet understand. And then the wind shifted again, stronger this time, pushing into the clearing, reminding her how quickly everything could change, and she turned back toward the structure, knowing she could not stand here any longer, knowing that whatever waited inside was her only chance, and yet something held her there for just a second longer, something unspoken, because when she looked back at the wolf, its eyes were still on her, steady, unreadable, and for the first time she felt the weight of what had just happened, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that this was not just survival anymore, this was something else, something she would not be able to explain even if she lived through it. And as she took the final step toward the shelter, a quiet thought followed her, one she could not shake, that the wolf had not just led her here, it had known this place existed long before she ever did. The structure did not look like rescue, it looked like something the forest had almost erased, its roof bowed under the weight of snow, its walls worn and dark as if they had been standing long before anyone remembered they were there, and Emily slowed as she approached, her steps uncertain not just from exhaustion but from doubt, because nothing about this place felt certain, not even now, not even with something solid in front of her, and she could feel the cold tightening again, pushing against her back, urging her forward whether she trusted it or not, and when she reached the door she hesitated, her hand hovering just inches from the surface, unsure of what she would find on the other side, unsure if this was shelter or just another illusion the forest had given her to keep her moving, and for a moment she did nothing, listening, hoping for any sign of life, any sound that would tell her she was not alone, but there was only silence, heavy and complete, and slowly she pushed the door, the wood resisting at first before giving way with a muted sound, opening into darkness that felt just as cold as the storm outside, and that alone almost made her stop, because she had expected warmth, expected something to confirm that this was safety, but instead she was met with stillness, with emptiness. And yet she stepped inside anyway because there was nowhere else to go, and the moment she crossed the threshold the wind fell away behind her, not gone but distant, as if the walls themselves held it back just enough to change everything, and she closed the door with what little strength she had left, leaning against it for support as her body trembled uncontrollably, and for a second she wondered if this was it, if she had made it just far enough to stop, just far enough to feel something other than the storm before everything went quiet. But then she noticed it, faint, almost impossible to detect, a subtle difference in the air, a trace of warmth that did not belong to the outside world, and her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, revealing the shape of the room, small, bare, but intact, and in the corner something else, something that had been used before, a place where the floor was worn, where the air felt slightly different, and she moved toward it instinctively, drawn by the smallest promise of survival, her movement slow, deliberate, as if rushing would break whatever fragile chance she had found, and as she reached the corner she sank down without thinking, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion it had been holding back, her back against the wall, her legs barely able to support her any longer, and she closed her eyes for a second, just a second, letting the stillness settle around her, letting the absence of the wind feel like something close to safety. But then a thought cut through the quiet, sharp and immediate, and her eyes opened again as she turned toward the door, because something was missing, something that had been there every moment until now, and she realized with a sudden clarity that the wolf had not followed her inside, that it had stopped at the edge of the clearing, that it had brought her here and then stayed behind, and that detail refused to make sense, because if this was shelter, if this was survival, why had it not come in, why had it remained outside in the cold it had just led her away from? And Emily pushed herself up slightly, ignoring the weakness in her body as she stared at the door, listening for any sign of movement beyond it, any indication that it was still there, and for a long second there was nothing, only the quiet of the cabin and the distant sound of the storm, and then, faint but unmistakable, she heard it, not a growl, not a call, but something softer, something carried by the wind, and it made her heart tighten in a way she did not expect, because it did not sound like a warning, it sounded like distance, like something already moving away, and she sat there, frozen in a different way now, realizing that whatever had brought her here was no longer at her side, and that realization brought with it a question she could not answer, because if the wolf had been guiding her to survive, why did it leave the moment she finally could? The silence inside the cabin did not feel like safety anymore, it felt incomplete, as if something essential had been left behind outside, and Emily sat there listening to the faint echo of the wind pressing against the walls, her body still trembling but no longer from the cold alone, because now there was something else moving through her, something restless, something that would not settle, and she realized it was the absence of the wolf, the sudden emptiness where its presence had been. Guiding, watching, choosing each step with a certainty she had come to rely on without ever admitting it, and now that certainty was gone, replaced by stillness that felt heavier than the storm itself, and she tried to convince herself that this was enough, that she had made it to shelter, that this was where the story should end, but the thought would not hold, it slipped away as quickly as it formed, because something about the way it had left did not feel like an ending, it felt like a decision, and that difference mattered more than she wanted it to, and she pushed herself up slowly, her legs unsteady but responding just enough, and she turned toward the door again, her eyes fixed on it as if it held an answer she had not yet found, and for a moment she hesitated, caught between the fragile warmth inside and the relentless cold waiting beyond, and logic told her to stay, to conserve what little strength she had left, to trust that this place was enough to keep her alive, but something deeper, something quieter, told her that staying might not be the same as surviving, and that thought unsettled her more than the cold ever had, because it suggested that the path she had followed was not finished yet, and slowly, almost without realizing she had made the choice, she stepped toward the door, her hand reaching for it again, the wood cold beneath her fingers, and she paused, listening, hoping to hear something that would confirm or deny what she felt. And at first there was nothing, only the distant howl of wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, faint, stretched thin by distance, a sound that did not belong to the storm, and it pulled at something inside her, not fear, not danger, but recognition, as if it carried meaning she could not fully understand, and before she could stop herself she opened the door, the cold rushing back in instantly, sharp and unforgiving, stealing the fragile warmth she had found, and she stepped just outside, her breath catching as the temperature pressed against her again, but she did not move back, she stood there, searching the clearing, her eye scanning the snow for any sign, any trace of where it had gone, and at first there was nothing, just the same endless white stretching outward, untouched and silent, and then she saw it, faint but clear enough to follow, a line of tracks leading away from the cabin, partially covered by drifting snow but still visible, still deliberate, and they did not wander, they did not hesitate, they moved in a single direction, deeper into the forest, and Emily stared at them, her mind struggling to reconcile what this meant, because if the wolf had left her here to survive, why had it continued on? Why had it not stayed to ensure she was safe? And the question grew heavier with each second she stood there, until it became something else entirely, not just confusion but doubt, because now she could not ignore the possibility that this was never meant to be the end of the path, that the cabin was not the destination but a pause, a place to recover just enough to continue, and that realization shifted everything, because it meant the choice she faced was not between staying and leaving, but between stopping and understanding. And as the wind picked up again, pushing against her back as if urging her to decide, she looked once more at the tracks disappearing into the trees, and a quiet thought settled in her mind, one that felt as undeniable as the cold itself, that whatever the wolf had been doing, it had not been finished, and somehow, neither was she. The cold felt sharper the second time, not because it had changed, but because now Emily understood what it could take from her, and still she stepped forward, her boots pressing into the faint trail left behind, each mark in the snow like a question she could not ignore, and with every step away from the cabin she felt the fragile safety behind her begin to disappear, replaced by the same endless uncertainty that had nearly claimed her before. But this time it was different, because she was not wandering, she was following, and that difference gave her just enough strength to keep moving, even as her body protested, even as her breath grew thinner again, and the forest closed in once more, the clearing fading behind her as the trees swallowed the light, their shadows stretching longer, deeper, until the world returned to that quiet, suffocating white and grey, and for a moment doubt surged again, stronger than before, because this made no sense. Leaving shelter to follow something she could not explain, something that had already left her behind, and yet the tracks continued, steady, deliberate, not scattered or panicked, and that steadiness pulled her forward, because it meant the wolf had not fled, it had chosen this path, and as she moved deeper she began to notice something else, something subtle but undeniable. The trail was no longer straight, it curved, weaving between the trees in a pattern that felt intentional, avoiding certain areas, guiding her through others, and she realized with a quiet shock that even now, even after it had left her, it was still leading her, still shaping the path she followed, and that realization brought with it a strange sense of urgency, because if it had gone ahead, if it had continued for a reason, then whatever waited at the end of this trail was not something she could afford to miss, and the thought pushed her forward faster than she thought possible, her steps uneven but determined, her focus narrowing to the marks in the snow, to the rhythm of movement that kept her from stopping. And then the forest shifted again, the ground rising slightly beneath her feet, the trees thinning just enough to open a narrow passage ahead, and the wind changed with it, stronger here, cutting through the branches with a sharper edge. And she hesitated for just a second, her instincts warning her that something ahead was different, something she needed to be careful of, but the tracks did not hesitate, they continued forward without pause, and she followed, because turning back no longer felt like an option. And as she stepped into the narrow passage, the snow beneath her feet felt harder, more compact, and she moved carefully, each step placed with growing awareness, her body learning from everything the forest had already tried to take from her. And then she saw it, not clearly at first, but enough to feel the shift in her chest, a break in the trees ahead, a faint glow of light reflecting off something beyond, and she moved toward it slowly, her breath catching as the space opened wider, revealing a slope that dropped away just beyond the edge of the path, and below it something she had not expected to see, something that did not belong in this endless wilderness, a narrow road, partially covered in snow but unmistakable, cutting through the forest like a line drawn by something other than nature. And for a moment she could not move, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, because this was not just a path, this was a way out, a connection to something beyond the forest, beyond the cold, and her heart began to race, a fragile surge of hope rising again, stronger than before. But then she noticed something else, something that stopped her from stepping forward. The tracks did not lead down to the road, they stopped at the edge of the slope, right where she stood, and she looked around quickly, searching for where they continued, but there was nothing, no sign of descent, no indication that the wolf had gone further, and the realization settled in slowly, heavier than the cold, that it had not gone to the road, it had brought her here and stopped, as if this was the point it had been leading her to all along. And Emily stood there, the wind rising around her, staring at the empty trail that ended at her feet, and a quiet question formed in her mind, one that refused to be answered. If the wolf had known this path, if it had guided her all this way, why did it never cross it itself? The road did not look like salvation at first, it looked distant, unreachable, a thin line cutting through the frozen world as if it belonged to another reality entirely. And Emily stood at the edge of the slope with the wind pushing against her back, her body trembling not just from exhaustion but from the weight of what she was beginning to understand, because the trail ended here, deliberately, precisely, as if every step before had been measured to bring her to this exact point, and for a moment she did not move, her eyes fixed on the empty snow where the tracks disappeared, her mind searching for something more, another sign, another direction. But there was nothing, only the silent truth that whatever had guided her had chosen this place as the end. And slowly she turned her gaze downward again, toward the road below, and this time she saw it differently, not as something distant but as something possible, because the slope, though steep, was not impossible, and the snow along it looked firmer, more stable than the hidden traps she had already survived. And a quiet realization settled into her, one that felt both simple and overwhelming, that she had been brought here because this was the way out. Not deeper into the forest, not further into the unknown, but back toward something human, something real. And her breath caught as she took a step forward, testing the ground carefully, her body moving with a caution it had learned too well, and the snow held beneath her weight, steady enough to continue. And she took another step, then another, descending slowly, each movement deliberate, her focus sharp despite the fading strength in her body. And as she moved down the slope, the forest above her seemed to grow quieter, as if it was already letting her go. And that thought made her pause for just a second, because something about leaving did not feel complete. And she turned her head slightly, looking back toward the place where the trail had ended, toward the trees that now stood still and distant. And for a moment there was nothing, only the same endless silence she had known before. But then she saw it, barely visible between the trunks, a shape that did not move but was unmistakably there, watching. And her heart tightened, not from fear but from something deeper, something she could not name, because even at this distance she knew it was the wolf, standing exactly where the trail had stopped, as if it had never intended to come any closer. And the realization struck her with a quiet force, that it had never been trying to escape the forest, it had always belonged to it. And she felt a strange pull, a moment of hesitation that made her wonder if she should go back, if she should return to the place where everything had begun, but the cold answered that thought immediately, pressing against her again, reminding her of what waited if she stayed, and she turned back toward the road, continuing her descent with a steadier resolve, and as her boots finally reached the packed snow below, the difference was immediate, the ground firmer, the path clearer, and for the first time since she had fallen, she felt something that resembled control, and she followed the road, not quickly, not easily, but forward, always forward, until the trees began to thin and the world opened just enough to reveal something ahead, a faint outline, a structure, distant but real, and she kept moving toward it, her steps slower now but certain, because she knew she was no longer lost, and when she finally reached a place where the road widened and the forest fell away behind her, she stopped, turning one last time to look back, and the trees stood silent, unchanged, as if nothing had ever happened there, as if no path had ever been made, no choice ever taken, and for a long moment she searched for any sign of the wolf, any movement, any trace that it was still there, but the forest gave her nothing, only stillness, and yet she knew, with a certainty that did not need proof, that it was watching from somewhere beyond what she could see, and as the wind shifted once more, carrying the faintest sound through the distance, she realized something she would never be able to explain.